My name is Daniel Mercer, and until 6 months ago, I thought I was living the American dream that I'm 42, with a successful career as a financial advisor at a respected firm in Boston. 15 years ago, I purchased a handsome colonial inn. Lexington, a leafy suburb with good schools and the kind of neighbors who wave when you drive by. We have neighborhood barbecues in summer and Christmas parties in winter. People shovel each other's driveways when it snows. I met Sarah during my second year at Boston College. She was studying communications, and I was in business. We had that kind of college romance that everyone envies, the type that transitions seamlessly from late-night study sessions to marriage without the drama that seems to plague other relationships. After graduation, we worked for a few years, saved up, and got married in a tasteful ceremony at her parents' church in Connecticut. Sarah built a career in public relations, working with several high-profile clients in Boston. She was good at her job. Excellent, really. She had a way with people, could read a room instantly, and knew exactly what to say to smooth over awkward situations. I admired that about her. Where I was sometimes awkward in social settings, Sarah was a natural. We complemented each other that way. After 10 years of marriage, we had settled into a comfortable routine. We renovated the colonial, modernizing the kitchen and bathrooms while keeping the historic charm. We traveled during our anniversaries: Paris, Rome, Tokyo. We discussed having children, but ultimately decided our careers were fulfilling enough. Our neighbor, Paul Wilson, moved in 2 years ago. He bought the Hendersons' place after they retired to Florida. Paul was recently divorced, in his late 30s, and worked as a creative director at an advertising agency in the city. He was the kind of guy who wore expensive casual clothes and drove a Tesla. At neighborhood gatherings, he always had the right anecdote, the perfect joke. Women found him charming. Men found him approachable. I found him perfectly pleasant. Sarah and Paul hit it off immediately. Professional overlap, she explained. Connections in the PR and advertising world. They had mutual contacts. It made sense they'd have things to talk about. I didn't think twice about it when they exchanged numbers at our block party. Networking. Sarah called it with a casual shrug. Our marriage wasn't perfect. No marriage is, but it was good. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our favorite restaurants. We knew each other's moods, could predict each other's responses to most situations. After 15 years together, I thought I knew everything about Sarah. I was wrong. The first hint something was off came last September. Sarah's work schedule had been changing. PR can be demanding. I understood that, but the pattern was becoming unpredictable. Late nights increased in frequency. Weekend emergency client meetings became common. The Morton account is in crisis mode, she'd explain, or the Westfield launch is being moved up. All plausible, all within the realm of normal professional demands. But then I noticed the small things. Sarah had always been somewhat protective of her phone, another professional necessity, given client confidentiality, but she became almost paranoid. The phone went everywhere with her. To the bathroom, to check the mail, to take out the trash. She set it face down when she wasn't using it. A new password appeared. Her wardrobe evolved subtly. Nothing dramatic. Sarah had always dressed well, but there were new items. More sophisticated lingerie. Perfume she'd never worn before. Our intimacy, never especially frequent, dwindled further. When it did happen, it felt mechanical, as though she were checking a box on her to-do list. Work stress, she said when I brought it up. This new client is killing me. I believed her. I had no reason not to. Then came the holiday party in early December. The neighborhood gathering at the Petersons' house. Sarah insisted we arrive separately. She had a late meeting and would meet me there. Fine. Reasonable. At the party, I noticed Sarah and Paul standing near the fireplace, drinks in hand. There was nothing overtly inappropriate about their conversation, but something in their body language struck me as odd. They stood closer than colleagues typically would. Sarah laughed at something Paul said, touching his arm briefly. Her eyes lingered on his face a moment too long. When I approached, they shifted slightly apart. The conversation became immediately more general, less animated. Paul nodded politely at me and excused himself to refresh his drink. What were you two talking about? I asked casually. Oh, just shop talk, Sarah replied. He's working with one of my former clients. That night, Sarah received a text message while we were getting ready for bed. I happened to glance over as she checked it. She angled the phone away almost imperceptibly, but not before I saw the name, Paul W. Everything okay? I asked. Just Carol from work. Forgot to send me the revised press release, she said smoothly. She typed a quick response and put the phone away. My stomach tightened. It was the first time in our marriage that I could remember Sarah lying to me directly. The text was clearly from Paul, not Carol. Why lie about something so trivial? Unless it wasn't trivial at all that I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to pay more attention. Not to spy, not yet, but to be more observant. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed Sarah began taking more calls in the other room or outside. She started doing her own laundry separately from our usual shared loads. Her schedule became increasingly erratic. She bought a new dress, but didn't wear it to any event we attended together. I overheard her laughing on the phone late one night. When I entered the room, she quickly ended the call. Paul's name came up in conversation more frequently, always in professional contexts. Twice, I saw Paul's Tesla drive past our house at unusual hours. None of these things, in isolation, meant anything definitive. Together, they formed a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore that I didn't want to believe it. I told myself I was being paranoid, reading too much into innocent coincidences. Sarah and I had 15 years together. She wouldn't throw that away. Not for Paul. Not for anyone. But the suspicion, once planted, grew like a weed. It was mid-January when my suspicions crystallized into certainty. Sarah mentioned a 3-day PR conference in New York. This wasn't unusual. She attended several industry events each year. She packed carefully, including the new dress I'd never seen her wear. I offered to drive her to the airport, but she insisted on taking a rideshare. "Don't be silly," she said. "You'd have to fight morning traffic coming back." After dropping her off, I returned home and tried to focus on work. I had taken the day to work remotely, planning to catch up on some client portfolios. Around 10 a.m., I realized I'd left some important documents in the trunk of Sarah's car, which was parked in our garage. She'd taken her smaller suitcase, preferring to use rideshare rather than drive to the airport and pay for parking. I went to get the documents from her car. As I popped the trunk, I noticed her car charger was missing. Odd, I thought. Why would she take it to a conference? A sickening possibility formed in my mind. I took out my phone and opened our location sharing app. We'd set it up years ago for practical purposes, to coordinate errands and arrivals home. I rarely checked it. Sarah's location showed she was not at the airport. She wasn't even headed toward New York. Her location pinged at a hotel downtown, about 30 minutes from our house. I sat in the garage for a long time, staring at that pulsing dot on my screen. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe the conference had been moved. Maybe she had a meeting before her flight. Almost mechanically, I found myself driving toward the hotel. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't even sure what I would do when I got there. Part of me hoped I'd find some innocent explanation that would make me feel foolish for doubting her. The hotel was upscale but discreet, the kind of place that catered to business travelers. I parked across the street and waited. For what? I wasn't sure. At 1:17 p.m., Sarah emerged from the front entrance. She was wearing casual clothes, not conference attire, and sunglasses despite the cloudy day. She looked around briefly before walking to the hotel's cafe entrance point. 10 minutes later, Paul walked in through the same entrance. I felt physically ill. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to storm into that cafe, to confront them both, to demand explanations. But something stopped me. An icy calm descended. If I confronted them now, what would happen? A scene. Denials. Damage control. Sarah was a PR professional, after all. She'd know exactly how to manage this crisis, and if this was happening, and it clearly was, I needed more information. I needed to understand the full scope before deciding how to proceed. I drove home, my mind eerily quiet despite the emotional earthquake taking place inside me. Over the next 3 weeks, I became someone I'd never thought I'd be, a husband spying on his wife. I purchased a small digital voice recorder and hid it in her car. I installed tracking software on our shared computer. I checked credit card statements meticulously. The evidence accumulated quickly. Sarah wasn't in New York at all. She had spent 3 days with Paul at the hotel downtown. They had been meeting regularly for at least 4 months. They communicated throughout the day, every day, using an app that deleted messages automatically. Paul had accompanied her on what she'd told me was a solo business trip to Chicago the previous month. They had dinner reservations for Valentine's Day at an expensive restaurant on the other side of the city that I listened to snippets of their conversations, enough to confirm the affair without subjecting myself to the most painful details. In one recording, I heard Sarah laugh in a way she hadn't laughed with me in years. In another, I heard them planning a potential future together. Daniel is so absorbed in his work, he'll never suspect, Sarah said during one recorded conversation. He's a good guy, but so oblivious. Sometimes I think I could leave a trail of breadcrumbs and he still wouldn't see what's right in front of him. Paul's response was less audible, but I caught enough. How much longer do we have to keep this up? I want you with me, not playing. House in the suburbs. Soon, she promised. I'm working on it. I just need to figure out the right timing. There's a lot at stake. That night, I sat alone in our home office, surrounded by evidence of my wife's betrayal, and made a decision. I would not confront her, not yet. I would not give her the opportunity to manage this situation, to control the narrative as she did so expertly in her professional life. Instead, I would prepare, methodically, thoroughly, and when the time was right, I would dismantle the life she thought she was cleverly orchestrating behind my back. Strategic planning has always been my professional strength. As a financial advisor, I help clients navigate complex situations, anticipate contingencies, and position themselves for optimal outcomes. Now, I would apply those same skills to my personal crisis. First, I secured my evidence. I backed up all recordings, text messages, location data, and financial records to multiple secure locations. I established 3 separate cloud storage accounts under different email addresses, each containing complete copies of the evidence. I also created an encrypted USB drive that I stored in my personal safe deposit box at a bank where Sarah and I did not have joint accounts. Redundancy was critical. I couldn't risk losing everything if Sarah discovered one cache of evidence. Next came the most crucial step, finding the right legal representation. This wasn't simply about hiring a divorce attorney. I needed someone who could match Sarah's skills at narrative control and crisis management. I conducted exhaustive research, reviewing case histories, client testimonials, and professional backgrounds of divorce attorneys within a 50-mile radius of Boston. I deliberately avoided firms where Sarah might have professional connections. Through her PR work, after narrowing my list to 5 candidates, I scheduled initial consultations with each, providing only vague details about my situation. I observed how they processed information, the questions they asked, their strategic thinking, and most importantly, their temperament. I needed someone meticulous but not vindictive, strategic but not unethical. Catherine Ellison emerged as the clear choice. A former prosecutor who had transitioned to family law 15 years ago, she had built a reputation for handling complex, high-asset divorces with surgical precision. Her office, located in a converted Victorian in a neighboring county, projected both professionalism and discretion, qualities I would need in abundance. During our second meeting, I revealed the full scope of the situation and presented my organized evidence. Massachusetts is a no-fault state, Catherine explained, her voice matter-of-fact but not without compassion. This means you don't need to prove adultery or any other specific wrongdoing to file for divorce. However, she continued, leaning forward slightly, evidence of adultery can still significantly impact property division and alimony determinations, especially if marital assets were used to fund the affair. She examined my evidence methodically, making occasional notes on a legal pad. Her glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed financial statements and location data printouts. "This is comprehensive," she noted with professional appreciation. "Most clients come to me with suspicions. You've brought me a case. I wanted to be thorough," I replied. "Thoroughness I appreciate. But Daniel," she said, removing her glasses, "I need to ask, what is your objective here? Vindication? Financial security? Punishment?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't fully articulated my goals, even to myself. "Justice," I finally said. "Proportionate consequences for deliberate actions." Catherine nodded slowly. "I can work with that. But justice in divorce is rarely clean or complete. We need to establish realistic expectations and a clear strategy." Over the next 2 hours, we outlined a comprehensive legal approach. Catherine explained that Massachusetts follows equitable distribution principles, meaning marital property would be divided fairly, but not necessarily equally. Given our situation, fair could lean significantly in my favor. Your prenuptial agreement actually works in your favor now, Catherine observed, reviewing the document I'd brought. When you married, Sarah's family anticipated she might inherit substantial assets they wanted to protect. But the agreement's reciprocal provisions now shield your accumulated wealth, given that her career has outpaced yours financially in recent years. We discussed the legal implications of Sarah's financial infidelity, her use of marital funds to finance the affair. In legal terms, this is called dissipation of marital assets, Catherine explained. When one spouse uses marital funds for non-marital purposes, particularly an extramarital affair, courts frequently award the innocent spouse compensation from the remaining marital estate. She pulled a thick legal reference book from her shelf and showed me relevant case law. Here, in Becker versus Becker, the court awarded the husband 65% of marital assets after proving the wife spent approximately $42,000 on an extramarital relationship. Your documentation suggests Sarah spent around $22,000 of joint funds on the affair. We can argue for similar treatment. Catherine then outlined a comprehensive legal timeline and strategy. Timing is crucial, she advised. Premature confrontation would allow Sarah to prepare her own defense, potentially hide assets, destroy evidence, and craft a counter-narrative. Given her professional background in crisis management, we should assume she would be formidable in controlling public perception. She recommended I continue gathering evidence while quietly securing my financial position. We need to prepare for various contingencies, she explained. Sarah might claim you were emotionally distant, neglectful, or that the marriage was effectively over before her relationship with Paul began. She might attempt to characterize your evidence gathering as stalking or invasion of privacy. Catherine pulled out another legal text. In Hastings versus Hastings, the wife's attorney successfully argued that the husband's extensive surveillance constituted emotional abuse, which impacted the final settlement despite her admitted infidelity. We need to demonstrate your actions were reasonable responses to legitimate suspicions, not obsessive behavior. She assigned me specific tasks. Document the chronology precisely. Establish that your information gathering began only after clear evidence of deception emerged. Maintain absolute normalcy in your interactions with Sarah. Don't do anything that could be construed as hiding assets or acting in bad faith. Catherine also connected me with two crucial specialists, James Morton, a forensic accountant specializing in divorce cases, and Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a therapist experienced in providing supporting documentation for divorce proceedings. James will trace marital funds Sarah spent on the affair and identify any hidden assets, Catherine explained. Dr. Chun will help document the psychological impact of Sarah's betrayal and provide expert testimony if needed. These professionals' insights will strengthen our position considerably. Before I left her office, Catherine handed me a thick folder containing information about divorce proceedings in Massachusetts, sample financial affidavits, and guidelines for documenting marital assets. Read all of this, she instructed. Understand the process completely. Knowledge is power, especially in situations where the other party has expertise in manipulating narratives. I followed her advice precisely, spending evenings studying Massachusetts divorce law while maintaining perfect normalcy with Sarah. I learned about automatic restraining orders that would prevent either of us from disposing of marital assets. Once proceedings began, I studied the differences between temporary and permanent alimony and how adultery impacts each. I researched case precedents involving infidelity and financial misconduct. Over the next month, I took several carefully calculated legal and financial steps under Catherine's guidance. I documented all our marital assets, creating a comprehensive inventory with supporting documentation, property deeds, investment account statements, insurance policies, retirement accounts, vehicle titles, art and jewelry appraisals, even photographs of significant household items with approximate values. Catherine arranged for a professional appraiser to discreetly assess our home's current market value, establishing a baseline for what would likely be our largest marital asset. I reviewed our prenuptial agreement with Catherine and a contract law specialist she recommended. They identified several provisions that significantly strengthened my position given the circumstances. I opened a separate bank account, not to hide money, but to ensure I would have access to funds when needed. Catherine advised depositing only my personal inheritance money, which was explicitly protected in our prenuptial agreement as separate property. James Morton, the forensic accountant, traced marital funds Sarah had spent on the affair, creating detailed reports that categorized expenditures, established patterns, and quantified the financial impact of her infidelity. I arranged a series of sessions with Dr. Chun, who documented the psychological impact of discovering Sarah's betrayal. These sessions were not merely therapeutic, but created a professional record that could potentially be submitted as evidence. I began subtly documenting which household items had sentimental or special value to me, taking photographs and noting their history and significance. Catherine explained that Massachusetts courts consider emotional attachment when determining property distribution. I established connections with several real estate agents to understand our home's market prospects, potential selling timelines, and options for buying Sarah out if I wished to keep the property. I met with my financial planning colleagues to structure my investments for potential liquidity needs, ensuring I could access funds without incurring significant penalties or tax liabilities. I researched apartment rentals within commuting distance of my office, securing a 6-month lease with a month-to-month option thereafter on a modest but comfortable one-bedroom unit. I created a detailed financial plan projecting various divorce settlement scenarios, calculating sustainable living expenses under each outcome. Catherine helped me draft preliminary court filings, including the divorce petition, financial statement, and motion for temporary orders regarding asset use during proceedings. Most importantly, Catherine arranged for me to meet with Judge Rebecca Hammonds, not about my specific case, which would have been improper, but as part of a professional financial advisors association lunch where she was speaking about divorce financial planning. This gave me invaluable insight into the judicial perspective and allowed Catherine to assess how Judge Hammonds, who handled many cases in our jurisdiction, might view our situation. Judge Hammonds has a reputation for being methodical and fair, Catherine noted after the event. She particularly dislikes being manipulated and values honesty above all. This works in our favor given Sarah's deception and your transparent documentation. Throughout this process, I maintained absolute normalcy in my interactions with Sarah. We continued our routines. I asked about her day. I mentioned nothing about New York or Chicago or any suspicious activities. I even remembered Valentine's Day, presenting her with the usual flowers and card before she left for her client dinner, the one I knew she would be spending with Paul. The acting was exhausting. There were moments when the rage and hurt threatened to overwhelm me, when I wanted to confront her as she returned home smelling of his cologne, when I wanted to drive to Paul's house and demand an explanation. But I contained it, channeling the energy into meticulous preparation instead. During our weekly status meetings, Catherine reminded me of the legal implications of losing control. Emotional outbursts can damage your position, she cautioned. Courts sometimes view confrontational behavior as evidence of volatility, which Sarah could use to characterize you as unstable or intimidating. She also warned me about common tactical errors in similar cases. Don't send angry texts or emails. Don't make threats. Don't engage in retaliatory behavior like canceling credit cards or changing locks. These actions might feel satisfying in the moment, but can severely undermine your legal position. Catherine also helped me prepare for the inevitable public and social fallout. Infidelity cases often become community spectacles, she explained. We need to be strategic about how information emerges and is perceived. To this end, I began laying groundwork in our social circle, not actively spreading information, but positioning pieces that would later be important. I became slightly more visible in community activities. I volunteered for the neighborhood association. I strengthened relationships with key neighbors, particularly those who had been in the community longest and held influence over local opinion. Social capital matters in these situations, Catherine advised. Courts don't officially consider community standing, but judges are human. A client with strong community ties and positive reputation benefits from subtle, intangible advantages. During this preparation phase, I observed Sarah and Paul becoming increasingly careless. They exchanged glances at neighborhood gatherings. They manufactured accidental meetings at local shops. Once, Sarah mentioned having run into Paul at a coffee shop 20 miles away. A coincidence so statistically improbable it was almost laughable. Their confidence grew as my apparent obliviousness continued. I intercepted messages where they mocked my trusting nature. Sarah began leaving more direct evidence, receipts in her pockets, unexplained charges on our joint credit card, obvious, gaps in her schedule. "I'm working late again tonight," she would say, not bothering to construct elaborate explanations anymore. "No problem," I would reply, smiling blandly. "Don't work too hard." James Morton, the forensic accountant, continued his financial investigation, uncovering increasingly damning evidence. Mrs. Mercer spent $22,647.83 of joint funds on expenses clearly related to the affair, he reported during our final meeting. This includes $7,842 on hotel rooms, $9,275 on restaurants and entertainment, $3,614 on gifts for Mr. Wilson, including a Breitling watch valued at $2,800, and $1,916.83 on weekend getaways described as professional development retreats on your tax returns. James created detailed spreadsheets categorizing each expenditure, complete with dates, locations, and corresponding evidence. "This level of documentation is compelling," he noted. "It establishes not just infidelity, but systematic financial deception." Catherine incorporated this information into our legal strategy. "Massachusetts courts take financial infidelity almost as seriously as sexual infidelity," she explained. Combined, they create a powerful case for asymmetric asset division. By early March, my preparations were complete. I had secured temporary housing. I had liquid assets available. I had legal representation prepared to file at a moment's notice. I had evidence chronicling months of deception and financial impropriety. All I needed now was the right moment to spring the trap. That moment arrived on March 15th. Ironically, the Ides of March. Sarah casually mentioned she needed to attend a weekend professional retreat the following month. "It's in the Berkshires," she said. "A leadership intensive for women in communications." I nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds interesting. When exactly?" "April 12th to 14th. I'll leave Friday morning and be back Sunday evening." I looked up from my laptop and smiled. "That's perfect timing, actually. I was planning to catch up on some client work that weekend." Later that evening, I checked her browsing history on our shared computer. As expected, I found reservations, not for any professional retreat, but for a luxury cabin near Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. Reservations for two. I immediately contacted Catherine. "We have our trigger event," I told her. "Perfect," she replied. "I'll have the papers ready for filing first thing Monday morning, April 15th. The timing couldn't be better. They'll be served while she's still recovering from the weekend's revelations." The time had come to implement the final phase of my plan. Strategic demolition requires precision. It's not enough to simply detonate explosives and watch things fall. You must understand the structural weaknesses, place your charges carefully, and control the collapse to maximize impact while minimizing collateral damage. My plan for Sarah and Paul would follow the same principles. Catherine had advised me to approach this final phase with clinical detachment. "This is no longer about emotion," she counseled. "This is about executing a legal and social strategy with precision. Every action must serve the larger objective." Phase 1 began with subtle information management. I reached out to Ellen Peterson, our neighborhood association president and renowned gossip hub. Over coffee, I casually mentioned concerns about home security. "I've been noticing some unusual activity on our street," I said. "Someone in a dark sedan parked for hours last Tuesday, and I could swear I heard someone in our backyard late one night." Ellen was immediately concerned. "Have you reported it? Should we alert the neighborhood watch?" I didn't get a clear look, I said. "It's probably nothing, but maybe mention it at the next association meeting, just so people keep their eyes open." This seemingly innocent conversation served a critical legal purpose, establishing neighborhood vigilance that would later document Paul's unusual comings and goings, creating a community record that could potentially support my case if witness testimony became necessary. Next came financial preparations. I transferred my personal inheritance, received years ago from my grandparents and kept separate per our prenuptial agreement, to an account Sarah couldn't access. I documented the transfer properly, nothing hidden or improper. This is entirely legal, Catherine had assured me. Your inheritance is explicitly protected as separate property in your prenuptial agreement. Moving it to an individual account before filing is prudent asset protection, not concealment. I also scheduled time off work for the week of Sarah's retreat, informing my office I would be working remotely on a special project. This flexibility would allow me to manage the inevitable chaos once the legal proceedings began. 3 days before the retreat, I implemented Phase 2. I contacted several key members of Sarah's professional circle, people I knew through years of accompanying her to work functions. I scheduled coffee meetings, lunches, brief encounters that seemed coincidental. Catherine had advised this approach. Creating inconsistencies in Sarah's professional narrative serves two purposes. First, it establishes a record of deception that extends beyond your marriage into her professional life, potentially impacting credibility assessments. Second, it creates witnesses who might later corroborate the pattern of dishonesty. To her boss, I mentioned my upcoming surprise for our anniversary, a trip I was planning for later in the year. I want to make sure it doesn't conflict with any major projects, I explained. Sarah's been working so hard lately, especially with all those weekend conferences. Her boss looked momentarily confused. Weekend conferences? You know, the leadership retreats, client weekends. She mentioned there's another one coming up in the Berkshires. The confusion remained. We haven't sponsored any leadership retreats this quarter. Perhaps she's attending through a professional association? Probably, I agreed easily. She's always developing herself professionally. It's one of the things I admire most about her. Similar conversations occurred with her closest colleagues. Never accusations, just innocent comments that created small inconsistencies in Sarah's carefully constructed narrative. Seeds of doubt, planted in fertile ground. The legal strategy behind these conversations was subtle but powerful. As Catherine explained, if Sarah later claims you invaded her privacy without cause, these conversations established that you were collecting information based on legitimate inconsistencies in her explanations, not out of baseless suspicion or controlling behavior. The day before Sarah was to leave for her retreat, I took a personal day from work. I spent it finalizing details and preparing our home. I moved certain important documents to my new apartment. I backed up and wiped my personal computer. I removed several family heirlooms for safekeeping. That evening, I was the perfect husband. I helped Sarah pack for her professional development weekend, even suggesting she take the new dress in case there's a formal dinner. We had a pleasant meal together. I wished her a productive retreat. We went to bed early. The next morning, I kissed her goodbye and watched her drive away. Then, I activated the final phase of my plan. First, I sent an email to Sarah's boss and key team members. It contained no accusations, simply a concerned inquiry about whether anyone had seen Sarah, as she seemed distressed at a client event I'd briefly attended the previous evening, an event I knew perfectly well didn't exist. I mentioned she'd been under significant pressure lately and had seemed not herself. This creates a documented timeline, Catherine had explained. It establishes that you had legitimate concerns about her behavior before any confrontation occurred. Next, I made several calls to local hotels, asking if they could check whether my wife had arrived safely for her conference. She was supposed to call when she got there, and I'm getting worried. Again, seeds of confusion, small inconsistencies that would grow into larger questions that I drove to our neighborhood coffee shop, visible and relaxed. I chatted with several neighbors, mentioning casually that Sarah was away for work and I was catching up on household projects. I made sure to appear near Paul's house several times throughout the day, waving cheerfully when he tentatively acknowledged me at precisely 3:15 p.m. I activated the most crucial element. I had discovered that Sarah and Paul planned to reach the New Hampshire cabin by 4 p.m. At 3:15, I contacted the New Hampshire State Police, reporting concerns about a potentially intoxicated driver headed toward the Lake Winnipesaukee area. I provided a careful description of Paul's Tesla, mentioned it had left from our town, and expressed worried concern as a responsible citizen. I wouldn't normally call, but the driver seemed very impaired when leaving a local restaurant. I'm probably overreacting, but I'd never forgive myself if something happened and I hadn't said anything. The officer took the information professionally. There was no guarantee they would intercept Paul's car, but even a brief traffic stop would create a record, a timestamp placing Paul on the route to the cabin when he should have been elsewhere. This isn't about creating legal trouble for Paul, Catherine had clarified when reviewing this element of the plan. It's about creating an official record that places him on that specific route at that specific time, a record that directly contradicts whatever alternate explanation they might concoct later. By 5 p.m., I received confirmation from Catherine that all legal documents were prepared for filing first thing Monday morning. The divorce petition ran to 47 pages, including detailed allegations of adultery with supporting evidence, documentation of financial misconduct, and a comprehensive schedule of marital assets with proposed division heavily weighted in my favor. Judge Hammonds is on the rotation for Monday, Catherine noted. Based on her history with similar cases, I've emphasized the systematic nature of the deception rather than emotional appeals. She responds well to factual precision. The petition included several key legal components: a request for pendant light, temporary, orders freezing all marital assets during proceedings, a motion for exclusive use of the marital home during the divorce process, a request for equitable distribution of marital property reflecting Sarah's dissipation of assets, a claim for compensation for legal and investigative expenses necessitated by Sarah's deception, a request for psychological evaluation if Sarah contested the evidence of infidelity. These initial filings set the tone for the entire process, Catherine explained. By coming in with overwhelming evidence and precise legal positioning, we create significant leverage for settlement negotiations. At 6:30 p.m., I posted a carefully worded message in our neighborhood social media group. Neighbors, please keep an eye out for any suspicious activity around our street this weekend. Sarah is away for work, and I've noticed some concerning activity recently. I've installed additional security cameras, but extra eyes are always appreciated. Neighbors immediately responded with support and concern. Ellen Peterson, as anticipated, called me directly. Daniel, I'm so worried about these security issues. Would you like to stay with us this weekend? No one should be alone if there's a safety concern. That's incredibly kind, I replied. But I've got everything secured. Actually, I'm having dinner with an old college friend tonight, so I won't even be home much. The college friend was actually Catherine, with whom I had a working dinner to review final details of our legal strategy. Throughout the evening, I maintained visibility on social media, posting a check-in at a local restaurant, responding to neighbors' comments with appreciation. Catherine and I discussed the likely legal countermoves Sarah might attempt. Based on her professional background, we should anticipate sophisticated responses, Catherine said as we reviewed documents over dinner. She'll likely attempt to reframe the narrative, perhaps casting herself as a neglected wife or you as controlling. She might file counter-allegations of emotional abuse or invasion of privacy. We prepared responses for each potential scenario. Catherine had drafted preliminary opposition motions to common tactics, including opposition to any attempt to characterize surveillance as stalking or harassment, motion to compel full financial disclosure if Sarah attempted to hide assets, request for psychological evaluation if Sarah denied the affair despite evidence, detailed chronology, establishing the reasonable basis for my information gathering. Courts generally don't look favorably on gaslighting, Catherine noted. If Sarah denies what the evidence clearly shows, it damages her credibility on all other matters. Saturday morning, I implemented the most public element of my plan. I visited 5 houses on our street, including those on either side of Paul's home. To each neighbor, I expressed the same concern. I hate to bother you, but have you noticed anything strange recently? Sarah's away for a work conference, and I've been getting some unusual hang-up calls. Last night, I thought I saw someone near our back door. The police suggested I ask neighbors if they've noticed anything suspicious. This carefully crafted statement served multiple purposes. It created community vigilance around our home, established a timestamp indicating Sarah was supposedly at a work conference, and initiated a neighborhood watch that would inevitably notice Paul's absence coinciding with Sarah's. By mid-afternoon, the neighborhood messaging group was buzzing with security concerns. Several neighbors reported seeing unusual vehicles on our street in recent weeks, including, predictably, mentions of a dark Tesla frequently parked nearby during weekday afternoons that I responded with measured concern, thanking everyone for their vigilance without drawing explicit connections. Privately, I documented every message, creating a social record that would become valuable during divorce proceedings. Saturday evening, I implemented the next phase. I called Sarah's parents in Connecticut, with whom we'd always maintained a close relationship. "I'm so sorry to bother you," I began, "but I'm a bit concerned about Sarah. She mentioned she was attending a work retreat in the Berkshires this weekend, but when I called the conference center to forward an important work message, they had no record of her or any PR event. I'm sure there's a simple explanation, but given those security issues we've been having in the neighborhood, I'm a little worried. Have you heard from her?" Her parents, predictably concerned, had not. "She did mention a work trip," her mother said, "but I thought it was in Vermont, not the Berkshires." Another inconsistency documented. I assured them I was probably overreacting and would keep them updated. Next, I called two of Sarah's closest friends, expressing similar worries. Both were immediately supportive, offering to reach out to Sarah directly. One mentioned that Sarah had told her about a girls' weekend in Maine. Yet another contradictory explanation. This pattern of inconsistent explanation strengthens the narrative of deliberate deception, Catherine had explained. It demonstrates that Sarah's behavior wasn't merely hiding facts from you, but actively creating false narratives for multiple people in her life. By Saturday night, Sarah's phone would be buzzing with concerned messages from parents, friends, and colleagues, all innocently inquiring about her well-being, all based on slightly different understandings of where she was supposed to be. Sunday morning, I took the final preparatory step. I drove to my newly rented apartment and fully set it up. I arranged for movers to be on standby for Monday afternoon. I confirmed with Catherine that all legal filings were prepared for 8 a.m. submission the next day. "The paperwork will be filed the moment the courthouse opens," she assured me. "The sheriff will serve Sarah at your home address by early afternoon. We've also prepared alternate service to her workplace in case she doesn't return home." Throughout Sunday, I maintained strategic visibility in the neighborhood. I attended morning services at the local church Sarah and I occasionally visited. I chatted with neighbors at the community park. I helped Mrs. Donovan across the street with her groceries. I created multiple witnesses to my calm, collected behavior. Witnesses who would later contradict any claims that I was erratic or unstable during this period. Sunday evening, I prepared our home for the final act. I gathered all remaining evidence, ensuring multiple backups existed. I removed the last few personal items of significant value or sentiment. I disabled the hidden recording devices, their purpose now fulfilled. I prepared a guest room where I would sleep that night, leaving our marital bedroom untouched but unavailable. Sarah was due home around 7 p.m. At 6:30, I received a text from her, "Leaving now. Traffic looks bad. Might be closer to 8. I responded with casual normalcy. "Drive safe. Dinner in the fridge if you want it." At 8:17 p.m., I heard her key in the lock. I was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing work documents, the picture of an unsuspecting husband. Having a quiet Sunday evening, Sarah entered, looking simultaneously relaxed and wary. The weekend had clearly been enjoyable, but returning to our shared fiction required a mental adjustment I could now clearly see on her face. "How was the retreat?" I asked pleasantly. "Intense but good," she replied, setting down her bag. "Lots of networking, some really useful sessions on crisis communication." I nodded with apparent interest. "Meet anyone interesting?" "A few people, mostly the usual industry crowd." She opened the refrigerator, examining the dinner I'd left. "How was your weekend?" "Quiet. Mostly," I said. "Did some work. Helped Mrs. Donovan with groceries." "Oh, and there was a bit of neighborhood excitement. Someone reported suspicious activity Friday night. A lot of the neighbors have been on high alert." Sarah paused, almost imperceptibly. "What kind of suspicious activity?" "Someone lurking around houses, apparently." Ellen Peterson organized an impromptu neighborhood watch. Paul Wilson was going to participate, but apparently he's out of town too. Some last-minute trip. I watched carefully as she processed this information, noting the slight tightening around her eyes. "Well, that's concerning," she said finally. "Hopefully nothing serious." "Probably just teenagers," I agreed. "By the way, your mom called. She seemed to think your retreat was in Vermont, not the Berkshires." I clarified for her. Another barely perceptible freeze. "Oh right, I must have misspoken when I talked to her last week." Easily done, I said, smiling. I'm turning in early tonight. Big day tomorrow. Client presentations all morning. I went to the guest room, leaving Sarah to wonder about the neighborhood watch, her mother's call, and my unusual sleeping arrangement. Seeds of doubt and uncertainty, carefully planted. The final confrontation would come tomorrow, after legal proceedings were already in motion. As Catherine had advised, control the narrative by controlling the timing. Once legal filings are public record, Sarah loses the ability to shape events to her advantage. Monday morning, I left early for client meetings, pausing at the door. Good luck with that Morton client today, I said casually. Sarah looked up from her coffee, momentarily confused. Morton, you mentioned they were having another crisis. Anyway, have a good day. I might be late tonight. Dinner with potential new clients. At precisely 8 a.m., Catherine filed our divorce petition with the county court. By 9:30, Judge Hammonds had reviewed and signed the temporary orders freezing all marital assets and granting me exclusive use of our home during proceedings at 10:15, I received confirmation from Catherine. Everything proceeding is planned. Sheriff has papers, service expected between 1 o'clock and 3 p.m. Judge Henderson was very interested in the financial documentation. I spent the morning at my office, informing my supervisor about the upcoming divorce in professional, measured terms. I wanted you to hear it from me directly, I explained. I don't anticipate it affecting my work performance, but I believe in transparency with the team. My supervisor was supportive, offering flexible scheduling if needed for legal proceedings. I thanked him and emphasized my commitment to maintaining professional standards throughout the process. At 12:30, I received a call from Ellen Peterson. Daniel, something strange is happening. There are 2 police cars outside your house, and I just saw Sarah arrive home. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, Ellen, I assured her. Just some legal matters being handled. I appreciate your concern. In reality, the sheriff was serving Sarah with divorce papers, temporary orders, and a notice to vacate our home within 48 hours. Catherine had arranged for a female deputy to accompany the sheriff, anticipating Sarah might attempt to claim intimidation. At 1:47 p.m., Catherine called. Papers served successfully. Sarah accepted service, but immediately called someone, presumably her attorney. Deputy reports she appeared shocked but composed. No scenes or confrontations. The machinery was now in motion. The community would soon know. Sarah's carefully constructed image would begin to crumble. At 3:15 p.m., my phone exploded with messages. Sarah had apparently begun reaching out to friends and neighbors, attempting to control the narrative. I didn't respond to any messages, following Catherine's advice to maintain complete silence until our scheduled court appearance. At 5:30 p.m., I returned home, accompanied by Catherine and a private security consultant she had recommended. Having neutral witnesses protects you from false allegations during this volatile period, she explained. Sarah was waiting, composed but clearly furious. She had changed into a professional outfit, armor for the confrontation. Paul Wilson's car was parked 2 houses down, not directly visible, but close enough for quick access. You've been planning this for months, she said as I entered. Not a question, an accusation. Yes, I acknowledged simply. All those recordings, all that spying, do you realize that's illegal? My attorney will have a field day with your invasion of privacy. Catherine stepped forward. Mrs. Mercer, I'm Catherine Ellison, your husband's attorney. I'd advise against making unfounded allegations of illegality. All evidence was gathered legally in response to reasonable suspicion of infidelity, which Massachusetts courts have consistently upheld as permissible. Sarah's eyes narrowed. This is a private conversation between my husband and me. Not anymore, I replied calmly. Not after you used our joint funds to finance your affair with Paul Wilson. Not after you lied to me, to your parents, to your colleagues. Not after you mocked me in text messages to our neighbor. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Sarah's face. What are you talking about? In response, I opened a folder and placed several documents on the counter. Credit card statements highlighting hotel charges, receipts for dinners, transcripts of recorded conversations discussing their relationship and their plans. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state, Catherine explained professionally. Courts take particular interest in cases where marital assets are used to support extramarital affairs. The documentation we've presented to the court is quite comprehensive. Sarah stared at the papers, her PR training visibly kicking in as she assessed the situation. This can be resolved privately, she said finally. There's no need to drag everyone into our personal business. That opportunity passed months ago. I replied. The court has already issued temporary orders granting me exclusive use of this house during proceedings. You have 48 hours to remove personal items. The order specifies exactly what you may take. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. You can't just throw me out of my own home. The court disagrees, Catherine interjected smoothly. Judge Hammonds found merit in our petition, particularly given the documented financial impropriety. Sarah reached for her phone. I'm calling Paul. Mr. Wilson has his own legal concerns to address, Catherine noted. The neighborhood association is currently reviewing security footage showing his regular visits to your home during your husband's work hours, visits that potentially violate association rules regarding home businesses and non-resident activities. This was another strategic element we had implemented. Massachusetts law had limitations on alienation of affection claims, but neighborhood associations had their own governance rules. Paul, as a homeowner subject to those rules, faced potential fines and social consequences independent of the divorce proceedings. This is insane, Sarah said. You've involved the entire neighborhood in what should be a private matter. I didn't involve the neighborhood, I corrected her. You and Paul did that when you conducted your affair in full view of our community, when you used our neighbors to cover your activities, when you lied to everyone around us. The security consultant, who had been quietly observing, spoke for the first time. Mrs. Mercer, I'm here to ensure an orderly transition. I'd be happy to explain the terms of the temporary order and help facilitate your removal of permitted personal items. Sarah looked from face to face, the full reality of her situation becoming apparent. The mask of control slipped completely. You've been planning this for months, she repeated, voice rising. Following me, recording me, spying on me like some kind of obsessed stalker. Actually, Catherine interjected, we've documented that. Mr. Mercer began investigating only after clear evidence of deception emerged. The chronology is quite specific in our filings. Sarah turned to me, switching tactics. Daniel, this isn't you. We can talk about this. Whatever problems we have, we can work through them without all this legal maneuvering. The time for talking was before you began sleeping with our neighbor. I replied evenly. Before you spent our money on hotel rooms and gifts for him. Before you mocked me to his face and planned how to leave me once you'd figured out, as you put it, the right timing. I placed a final document on the counter, a printout of text messages between Sarah and Paul discussing their future plans, including how to manage their eventual revelation of the relationship. Sarah stared at the messages. How did you get these? That's not relevant, Catherine replied. What matters is that they exist and are now part of the court record. Mrs. Mercer, I strongly suggest you contact your attorney immediately. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for Thursday morning. Judge Hammonds expects both parties to be fully prepared. As Catherine had predicted, Sarah's PR instincts took over. She straightened, gathered her composure, and nodded curtly. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. Actually, I said quietly, it is. The weeks following that confrontation unfolded with the inexorable progress of a well-planned military campaign. Each phase proceeded as anticipated, with occasional tactical adjustments but no strategic surprises. Sarah moved into a downtown apartment, not with Paul, as might have been expected, but alone. According to neighborhood sources, their relationship had cooled considerably once the practical realities of the situation became apparent. Paul, facing community censure and potential professional embarrassment, had apparently developed reservations about a woman whose careful planning hadn't extended to anticipating her husband's counter-strategies. Our preliminary hearing before Judge Hammonds went exactly as Catherine had predicted. Sarah appeared with counsel, Lawrence Thornton, a respected family law attorney known for representing high-profile clients. He attempted to characterize my evidence gathering as obsessive surveillance, implying it constituted a form of emotional abuse. Judge Hammonds was unpersuaded. The documentation indicates Mr. Mercer began investigating only after observing multiple inconsistencies in Mrs. Mercer's explanations, she noted. The chronology appears to establish reasonable suspicion. prior to any surveillance activities. When Thornton suggested the recordings might have been obtained illegally, Catherine was prepared. Your Honor, Massachusetts follows the one-party consent rule for recordings. Additionally, all surveillance occurred in spaces where there was no reasonable expectation of privacy. Vehicles registered jointly to both parties, common areas of the marital home, and public locations. Judge Hammonds reviewed the evidence logs carefully. The court finds no immediate indication of improper evidence gathering, though Mr. Thornton may file specific objections to individual items if he identifies legal deficiencies. The temporary orders remained in place. Sarah was excluded from our home, assets remained frozen, and all financial accounts required judicial approval for withdrawals exceeding routine living expenses. Community reaction followed predictable patterns. Initial shock gave way to taking sides. Sarah, with her PR expertise, attempted to control the narrative among our social circle, positioning herself as a woman who had found herself trapped in a loveless marriage and seeking emotional connection. Elsewhere, however, the evidence of her systematic deception, not just to me but to friends, colleagues, and family, undermined this portrayal. The multiple contradictory explanations she had given for her whereabouts created a credibility problem even among her supporters. Paul faced his own social consequences. The neighborhood association, though not officially involved in our divorce, conducted a review of security concerns raised during my Worried Husband campaign. Security camera footage from multiple homes documented Paul's regular visits while I was at work. Visits that technically violated association rules regarding non-resident activities on residential properties. The association board, led by Ellen Peterson, issued Paul a formal warning and a modest fine. More significantly, it created a public record of his involvement that circulated throughout the community's social network. Professionally, both Sarah and Paul faced complications. Sarah's deception extended into her work life, the non-existent conferences, fabricated client emergencies, and misused company time created problems with her employer. The HR department launched a review of her expense reports and timesheets after receiving anonymous information suggesting potential improprieties. Paul's creative director position required client confidence and community standing, both now compromised by his involvement in a neighborhood scandal. Several of his key accounts requested different creative teams, citing concerns about judgment and discretion. Catherine continued implementing our legal strategy with surgical precision. The forensic accountant's report detailing Sarah's misuse of marital funds was submitted to the court, along with documentation of her systematic pattern of deception. During discovery proceedings, Lawrence Thornton attempted to portray me as emotionally distant and controlling, suggesting the marriage had been functionally over before Sarah's relationship with Paul began. Catherine countered with affidavits from mutual friends documenting our apparently happy relationship, financial records showing joint vacations and anniversary celebrations, and, most damaging, text messages between Sarah and Paul explicitly discussing how to manage perceptions of our marriage while conducting their affair. We need people to think everything's normal with you and Daniel, Paul had written, at least until we figure out the best way to handle the transition. Sarah's response was particularly damning. Don't worry, Daniel is clueless. He actually believes I'm at a conference right now. As long as I keep the story straight, we can manage this however we want. Judge Hammonds reviewed these messages with visible disapproval. The court cannot ignore evidence of deliberate deception, she noted during a preliminary assessment. Mrs. Mercer's communications suggest a calculated approach to maintaining appearances while pursuing extramarital activities. 3 months into proceedings, Sarah's attorney requested settlement negotiations. Catherine had anticipated this move. Once the evidence is fully documented and the judge's inclinations become clear, settlement becomes the logical option for the party with weaker positioning. The settlement conference occurred in Catherine's office. Sarah and Lawrence Thornton sat across from us, their demeanor suggesting recognition of their limited leverage. My client is prepared to be reasonable, Thornton began. Despite the unfortunate circumstances, she recognizes the marriage cannot continue and wishes to resolve matters efficiently. Catherine smiled professionally. We appreciate that perspective. Given the documented financial impropriety and other factors, we propose the following terms. She slid a document across the table outlining our position. I would retain the Lexington home, buying out Sarah's equity share at 30% rather than 50%, reflecting the court's likely consideration of her marital misconduct. My retirement accounts would remain entirely separate, while Sarah's would be subject to limited division per the terms of our prenuptial agreement. Sarah would receive no alimony, based on her substantial earning capacity and the short duration of our marriage. Sarah would bear responsibility for her own legal fees and 70% of the forensic accounting costs necessitated by her financial misconduct. A non-disparagement clause would prevent either party from making negative public statements about the other. Thornton examined the document, his expression revealing nothing. These terms are significantly weighted in your client's favor. They reflect the reality of the situation, Catherine replied calmly. The evidence is overwhelming. Judge Hammonds has already indicated her concern regarding Mrs. Mercer's credibility and financial behavior. Our proposal actually represents a more favorable outcome than Mrs. Mercer would likely receive if we proceed to trial. Sarah leaned forward. You expect me to walk away with nothing after 15 years of marriage? That's absurd. Not nothing. I corrected her. Approximately 30% of our marital assets, which is generous considering Massachusetts courts routinely award larger portions to the wronged spouse in cases involving significant infidelity and financial impropriety. Furthermore, Catherine added, we've not pursued claims related to alienation of affection or intentional infliction of emotional distress, though evidence would support both. Our proposal represents a clean break with minimal continuing entanglements. Sarah and Thornton conferred quietly. After several minutes, Thornton looked up. We'll need to counter with different terms regarding the house and retirement accounts. We'll consider reasonable counterproposals, Catherine allowed, but the fundamentals reflect the likely court outcome given the evidence. The negotiation continued for 4 hours, ultimately reaching terms not significantly different from our initial proposal. Sarah would receive a cash payment representing 35% of the home's equity. Retirement accounts would be divided according to the prenuptial agreement with a slight adjustment in Sarah's favor. The non-disparagement clause remained, with financial penalties for violations. As we finalized the settlement, Sarah spoke directly to me for the first time in hours. You planned all of this from the beginning. This was never about reconciliation or understanding. No, I agreed. Not after I heard you and Paul mocking me for being too trusting. Not after I learned you were using our money to finance your affair. Not after I discovered you were planning to leave me anyway, just on your timeline rather than mine. She shook her head slowly. I never thought you capable of this level of calculation. I learned from the best. I replied quietly. 15 years watching a master manipulator at work teaches you something about strategic thinking. Once the settlement was signed, our direct interaction ended. The divorce was finalized 60 days later with minimal court involvement. The settlement approved by Judge Hammonds with only minor modifications regarding specific asset valuations. The aftermath extended beyond legal proceedings. Sarah's professional reputation suffered significant damage. The PR firm where she had built her career placed her on administrative leave during their internal review of her expense reports and time management. Though no formal misconduct was proven, the cloud of suspicion combined with client concerns about her judgment led to a negotiated departure rather than termination. Paul Wilson's situation evolved differently. Initially supportive of Sarah, he gradually distanced himself as the community and professional consequences became apparent. According to neighborhood sources, they continued seeing each other briefly after the divorce filing, but the relationship deteriorated under the weight of practical realities. Paul sold his home 6 months after our divorce was finalized, relocating to Seattle for what he described as a career opportunity. The real estate agent handling the sale confided to Ellen Peterson that he had accepted an offer significantly below market value to expedite his departure from the community. Sarah remained in Boston, but moved to a different suburb, reportedly, accepting a position with a smaller PR firm at a substantial reduction in both compensation and prestige. According to mutual acquaintances, she had attempted to reframe her experience as a journey of self-discovery and growth, a narrative that found limited acceptance given the well-documented facts of the situation. As for me, the aftermath brought unexpected developments. The process of dismantling my marriage, while strategically satisfying, had left emotional consequences requiring attention. Following Catherine's recommendation, I continued sessions with Dr. Chun, addressing the trust issues and latent anger resulting from Sarah's betrayal. Strategic victory doesn't automatically create emotional healing, Dr. Chin observed during one session. You executed a brilliant campaign, but now comes the harder work of rebuilding your capacity for trust and vulnerability. I focused on reconstructing my life methodically. I retained our Lexington home, but renovated extensively, removing reminders of Sarah's presence. I maintained key community relationships while severing connections that carried too many painful associations. I invested additional time in professional development, earning an advanced certification that positioned me for partnership consideration at my firm. 18 months after the divorce, I was invited to join a financial literacy program at Brandeis University as a guest lecturer. There I met Rebecca Harrington, a professor of economics with a straightforward manner and quiet intelligence that contrasted sharply with Sarah's calculated charm. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and radical honesty. Before it progressed beyond friendship, I shared the complete story of my marriage and divorce, including my methodical response to Sarah's betrayal. That's quite a story, Rebecca said after listening carefully. Most people wouldn't have had the discipline to execute such a comprehensive plan. Most people haven't spent 15 years with someone who turned out to be expertly manipulating them, I replied. I'm not particularly proud of how calculated it all was, but I couldn't see an alternative that wouldn't have left me at a significant disadvantage. Rebecca considered this thoughtfully. I appreciate your openness about it. Calculated, yes, but also proportionate to the deception you faced. The question is whether that experience has made you someone who sees relationships as strategic exercises, rather than partnerships built on trust. It was exactly the right question, direct, insightful, and focused on the future rather than the past. That's what I've been working through with Dr. Chun, I acknowledged. Learning to trust again without being naive, to be vulnerable without being exploitable. Good answer, Rebecca said with a small smile. I'd like to hear more about that. Work sometime. Our relationship progressed deliberately, each step taken with conscious intention rather than swept along by emotion or convenience. Rebecca's analytical mind appreciated the careful consideration, while her emotional intelligence helped me reconnect with feelings I had suppressed during the divorce campaign. 3 years after my divorce was finalized, Rebecca and I married. In a small ceremony attended by close friends and family, we wrote our own vows, emphasizing honesty, mutual respect, and the courage to address problems directly rather than allowing them to fester beneath artificial harmony. Sarah sent a congratulatory card, a gesture of apparent goodwill that also served as a reminder of her continued awareness of my life events. I acknowledged it with a brief, polite note and then filed it away, neither disturbed by the connection nor interested in maintaining it. Paul Wilson occasionally appeared in advertising industry publications, his career in Seattle apparently regaining momentum after a difficult transitional period. According to mutual connections, he never publicly discussed his role in our divorce, maintaining professional silence about personal matters as for the neighborhood that it served as the stage for so much of the drama. Life continued with the rhythmic predictability of suburban existence. New families moved in, others departed. Gossip evolved to incorporate fresh scandals and concerns. Ellen Peterson continued her role as unofficial community hub, occasionally mentioning that terrible business with the Mercers as a cautionary tale about appearances versus reality. Looking back now, 5 years removed from the events, I can see the experience with greater clarity. Sarah's betrayal was devastating not merely because of the infidelity, but because it revealed that the person I believed I knew intimately had never truly existed. The woman I married and lived with for 15 years was a carefully constructed facade, a masterful performance maintained so seamlessly I never questioned its authenticity. My response, calculated, methodical, and comprehensive, reflected both strategic thinking and emotional self-protection. Was it excessive? Perhaps. Was it proportionate to the deception I faced? I believe so. What matters now is not the past campaign, but the life I've built afterward. Rebecca and I have created a relationship founded on principles fundamentally Different from my marriage to Sarah, radical honesty instead of convenient fictions, direct communication instead of strategic manipulation, mutual support instead of competitive advantage. When people ask about my divorce, I offer minimal details. It ended badly, I typically say, but it taught me valuable lessons about what matters in a relationship. Those lessons inform every aspect of my current marriage. Rebecca and I make decisions jointly, with transparent discussion of motivations and concerns. We address disagreements directly rather than allowing resentments to accumulate. We verify important facts without apologizing for needing certainty. The experience with Sarah left permanent marks, certainly. I maintain more extensive financial documentation than most people would consider necessary. I notice inconsistencies and explanations more quickly than others might. I verify information that most would accept at face value. But these tendencies serve a constructive purpose now rather than a defensive one. They're integrated into a life built on earned trust rather than assumption, on demonstrated reliability rather than blind faith. The silent reckoning with Sarah was never about revenge, though it certainly contained elements of justified retribution. It was about establishing boundaries, asserting consequences for betrayal, and refusing to allow someone who had systematically deceived me to control the narrative of our separation. In that sense, it accomplished exactly what it needed to. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more real-life accounts of betrayal and its consequences. Remember, these stories are shared not to promote vengeance, but to illustrate the human capacity for resilience. In the face of profound betrayal, sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about getting better.